then, there it is. So now here in this here dumb video, you're going to learn a few things about the Pentastar Tick. In the broad overview, the Pentastar Tick is one of two pattern failures with this van and this engine that are its Achilles heels. The good news is that the Pentastar Tick being 50% of it and the oil cooler leak being the other, both are solved by upgradable parts. And once you do those two upgrades, for the most part, you could pretty much forget about everything related to the engine other than oil changes and basic maintenance. But the basic guts of the engine are 500,000 mile engine, no sweat, we do it all the time. This one has 830. Okay, but the Pentastar Tick is the Achilles heel. What is it? Well, it's a ticking noise caused by wear of the rocker arm needle bearings. This week I did a rocker arm job, so I just happen to have the parts here. Your engine has 24 valves, so it has 24 rocker arms, and here's 22 of them. Here's a marginal one. Can you see that play and even hear that sound? Well, when that gets worse, you get this, which is totally seized, okay? Now what this is the roller bearing of this rocker arm. It should roll like that freely. And the reason it rolls is because it lives on your camshaft and it rolls along. I'm doing this upside down, it actually points down, but it doesn't matter. A good one lives here and it rolls along, and as the cam lobe or giant lovely nipple comes up, it pushes down and this rocker arm rocks and actuates the valve. It opens and closes the valve. Well, when the roller seizes so that it can't roll anymore, you see what it does. It gouges, get in there tight, son. You can see exactly what it does. It gouges the cam lobe and wears it out. And it wears it round, and round ain't gonna bump, and no bump means no valve motion. This symptom then becomes a single cylinder misfire where that valve either isn't open when it should be or isn't closed when it should be, and it bleeds off compression and it misfires. The ticking sound itself is caused because of clearance, partially this clearance, partially the clearance that allows the rocker arm, I don't know if you can see that, but to move. Now, a couple of things to know. One is that in late 2019, Chrysler released the revised rocker arm, whose part number ends in 296AH, H being the revision, called H rockers, which features a redesigned needle bearings. What really fails in here is the needle bearings of this roller, and they disintegrate and they stop rolling, there's clearance, blah, blah, blah. The revised AH rockers do seem to, by all reports, ameliorate the problem permanently. We have never had to redo this rocker arm job, regardless of miles, once we put the AH rockers in there. By now, of course, we don't know exactly when the production vans at the end of calendar year 2019 got, what month they came out or whatever, but I know that we started buying them in very late 19 or early 2020 is when I started hearing about them and installing them. So by now, you go anywhere and you get AH rockers whether you want them or not. When you do that, I'm hesitant to say this because there are probably exceptions, but you need to buy these AH rockers from Chrysler. Why? Because when you go on Amazon, it'll have that part number and those pictures, but it'll be some Chinese counterfeit. Melling also sells a rocker arm, and I had assumed that Melling, the company, was the original supplier, but they're not. Melling makes those rocker arms, but they're not AH rockers. Are they as good as AH rockers? I don't know. Melling's great stuff, but I got in touch with them personally and said, no, these are not, we don't sell these to Chryslers. We are not the OE Tier 1 supplier for these rocker arms. I don't know who makes them. I assume Chrysler makes them, or some company you never heard of makes them. So because you're only going to do the job once, and because we're not talking about thousands of dollars difference between the cheapest rocker arms available and the real Chrysler ones, get the real Chrysler ones. You're going to pay about 12 bucks a piece, and you got 24 of them. Live a little, why don't you? When you do this job, the upgrading of the rocker arms to ameliorate the Pentastar Tick, the only other thing to know is that the lifter, which is a little cylinder that lives under here, I don't have any handy right now, a little $8, $9 lifter. It's called a lifter, but it really acts as a shock absorber. Those either go or they don't. You can test them in the block. Push on them. If they compress, replace them. If they don't compress, they're fine. And they will go to 5, 6, 7, 800,000 miles. Not a big deal. Now, the important thing to know about this job is you're about to see a good example of the sound that this makes. And remember, Once you hear this sound, try not to confuse this sound for any other sound. You can't quite tell where it's coming from, but it is obvious. If you listen to it as an aggregate noise of the entire van, you can hear the tick clearly. They will all tick a little bit, but it's more like a light chatter, like a typewriter. That is like a guy really typing. So that is that's what you're after. You can also localize this sound with a stethoscope or a piece of hose or something if you can find it. It's going to obviously it's going to be under a valve cover. But the most important thing that you need to know is that the real confirmation for me is I'll cut open an oil filter with at least 1,000, 1,500 miles, 2,000 miles on it. And when I find metal, ooh, come with me, son. Come look at my thing. I just remember I happen to have this oil filter because I did this exact test earlier this week and have not emptied the trash. Unless I did empty the trash. I did not empty the trash. Ew. All right. This is the oil filter from that van. One side will be, and you'll cut it open, you'll just destroy it and cut it open, no big deal. But that's what you're looking for. I don't know if you can see, but you see that amount of glitter? That amount of glitter, especially that sort of black stuff, that amount of glitter is 99% confirmation that you have the Pentastar Tick, because that's where this glitter comes from. It comes from those ground up needle bearings and bits of camshaft. This is a cheap diagnostic, because when you're going to look at a used van, you could diagnose it just by cutting open the filter, whether it's making a sound or not. So that's handy. Okay, well, what have we learned? We've learned what is the Pentastar Tick. We've learned what causes it. We've seen examples of it, how to diagnose it. Now we're going to learn how to fix it, goddammit. Okay, step one, never give a dog a chicken bone. That's unrelated. It's true, though. The tick is books at 8 hours. That's how shops do it. They have a book that tells them how long this job will take. 8 hours plus parts. Broadly speaking, in this world in which we live in the midst of 2024, you're going to spend $1,400 to $2,000 for the job. Okay, great. There are some other things you can do while you're in there that make sense, but not necessarily. The hardest part of the job is getting the valve cover off. The actual doing of the rockers isn't very difficult. It requires a special tool, which is $17 on Amazon, and the rest is just very simple. It's essentially no different than any other overhead cam engine, how you replace the rocker arms. If you, as I mentioned, if you spend that money, you're never going to do this job again, and you've solved half of the Pentastar Tick problems. I should also mention that the problem historically for your 14, well, all Pentastars, which means they're in cop cars, minivans, Journeys, Challengers, whatever, trucks. Historically, the problem comes on around 110,000 miles. If you were to plot it out to a graph, your median would be around 110,000. But it doesn't have to be. Many engines never develop it. Many engines develop it sooner. I want to talk about one more thing before I let you get back to your masturbation Sunday, is that the time span between when it starts and when you have to do something and what that's going to look like. So let's imagine you're tooling down the road one day and you notice at idle, and usually a little bit more so when cold, tick, 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 tick. Okay, you can ignore that. 10, 15, 30, 100,000 miles later, the real start of the symptom is a single cylinder misfire. Those codes are going to read P030X, with the X being 1 through 6, denoting which cylinder it is. Now, what happens is people get a P0303 for cylinder 3 misfire, and they go in and they treat it like ignition. They go in and replace coils and spark plugs and that sort of thing. If you put in fresh stuff, the code may go away for a week or two, but it's going to come back. Which is why I encourage people not to just knee-jerk throw ignition parts at this thing. Actually, what you should do is, let's say you have a misfire in number 3, move plug, coil, and boot from number 3 to number 1 and vice versa, and see if the code moves. If the code moves to 301, then you know that you had a bad plug, coil, or boot. If it doesn't move, then you know, you forget everything about ignition. You know that you got known good parts and you're dealing with a compression issue. You can put a compression gauge on it and you'll be able to see it. Usually a misfire will hit around 90 pounds, 95 pounds, normal or nominal for these vans, depending on what compression tool you use to read them. 130, 140 pounds, as much as 180, but regardless, it doesn't matter. It's a relative compression, and what you would do is just check the misfiring cylinder against any cylinder next to it or any other cylinder, and if it's at 80 pounds and the other one's at 120, you know that's where your problem is. And then, as I mentioned, the third final step of the diagnostics is cut the oil filter open. When you get the single cylinder misfire code, you won't notice it running bad at all, and it won't be running bad because it's misfiring below the threshold to light, or well, above the threshold to light the light, but there's another, I mean, it can misfire multiple times and it won't light the light because it has to come over a certain amount per cycle and that lights the light. When the light is flashing, that means it's actively misfiring. It's missing enough times out of some number that the computer's flashing the light at you. And that you will feel. When the light is flashing, it'll feel like you're running over rumble strips, like you've got an unbalanced dildo, like that. And you'll definitely know it. And then the very final stage, I know it because I've done it, is to just keep driving until that cam shatters or it sucks a valve and the engine grenades, and it'll snap the chain and it'll take the engine out eventually. But the important thing to know is, from the time when you first get a misfire code to the time when the light is flashing and you really need to stop driving, it can be as much as 35, 40,000 miles. In my case, personally, it was 40,000 miles. That's quite some time for most people who aren't using them commercially. I mean, so it's not like you gotta panic this second, but it is a terminal problem. It will take the motor out, and a rocker arm job is a lot cheaper than the motor. Well, we've learned all of it, haven't we? There's been so much, mine is empty, yours is filled. Well, there you go. Well, as you know, videos every week. Like and subscribe and like, touch yourself, touch me, we'll touch each other, we'll touch the tips. There'll be massive amounts of touching. And look at the rest of my channel for mostly dick jokes, but some useful information. And I love you, and let's cuddle. Mwah! She's a goddamn lovely man. She's a love.